For over 41 months, Russia has waged war on Ukraine, and today we'll examine the military situation. I'm Julian Robke, and this is BILD Situation Room. And we start north of the embattled city of Pokrovsk. There, Russian troops, according to BILD information, launched a major offensive right after the agreement last week between Trump's special envoy Witkoff and Vladimir Putin ahead of a meeting between the two presidents. Specifically, it was coordinated, so to speak, with the meeting planned in Alaska this week. We have a massive breakthrough by the Russian army here. We want to take a look at it on the map first. And we can observe that Russian troops have advanced up to 18 kilometers in this area over the past 5 or 6 days. This was the situation we experienced last week, and we basically thought, or rather the Russians also gave the impression of, making significant progress in their operations. What they attacked, that Pokrovsk and Mönchgrad, meaning this entire area here, was their primary objective. Instead, the Russian army unexpectedly advanced towards the north, broke through, set off in the direction of Dobropilya, and their objective, which we can briefly mark here, appears to be this crucial connecting road. The only connecting road between the two last major cities in the Donbas, Slovyansk and Kramatorsk on one side, and the region as well as the metropolis of Dnipro or Dnipropetrovsk on the other side. We're taking a closer look at the current situation this morning, and we're carefully observing what happened here. Yes, the Russians advanced around 15 kilometers. We can see the road that we just showed before. At least it was cut off by Russian infantry units or motorcycle units advancing in that direction. We'll look at all that in video shortly. And we also see that the assumption which was actually made that the Russians would now try to capture Pokrovsk or attack from above, that this essentially dissolved, at least for the day, due to a maneuver by the Russian army, and instead the Russians are now moving north here with the clear aim to cut off the last two major cities completely. And that's interesting in that supposedly the Russian proposal right now is on the table, that they demand the withdrawal of Ukrainians from the Donbas, specifically from these two major cities, and in return they would not advance further in the south. The Russians obviously appear to have laid out all the facts in advance, which provided them with the option to withdraw their own offer later if they chose to do so. We have Dobropilya here, an important city nearby. There were also reportedly attempts by the Russians to infiltrate, but those efforts were successfully repelled. And today we have the situation that up here near Soloti, Kolodjas, the Russian army is trying to gain a foothold, and this part of the road is extremely at risk, or is reportedly already said to have been crossed by individual Russian soldiers. First, let's take a closer look at why this advance has suddenly turned out to be so remarkably successful. And a major issue that we repeatedly see and also hear about from Ukrainian soldiers is the active or acute shortage of personnel on the Ukrainian side. We are looking at footage from Rusin Yar, from this small village here, and there we can see relatively clearly where the Russians have gained a foothold. Let's take a closer look at that, not just in the ruins of the village itself, but also in the surrounding areas. But particularly here we see it in the ruins of the village itself, but especially in the bunker facilities that the Ukrainian army prepared over the months, which were not occupied, or at least so thinly manned that the Russians managed to seize the entire area extremely quickly and without much resistance. We're now seeing these facilities, we're seeing the approach of a Ukrainian drone towards these facilities, we're seeing that these are massive bunkers. The first attack, if I'm not mistaken, targets the door here. That means we're also seeing an iron door that was prepared here. Now we're looking at this bunker from a different perspective, and it's clear how extremely elaborate it is. We have these large sandbags, nearly completely filled with sand here on the lower side. We have them on both sides, meaning proper trench systems were set up. We have the concrete here, several layers of concrete that have been stacked on top of each other. At the top we have both a stove for the winter and ventilation for the summer, as well as for the entire time. We can see that these entire installations weren't occupied by the Ukrainian side, despite being installed here with significant cost, time and effort, but that they were taken over by Russians, who then concealed themselves in response. What we're witnessing now are Ukrainian strikes targeting their own bunker facilities near Rusin Yar. Yes, what shows us quite clearly is that the severe personnel shortage forced them to abandon these facilities rather than defend them effectively. If a Ukrainian soldier was even there and the Russians took over, we now see further attacks on bunker facilities, all of which were just taken over by the Russians a few days ago. That means these are all bunker facilities built by the Ukrainians. We're now seeing this attack from different perspectives. Here we can see it quite clearly, the trench leading in this specific direction over there into the designated area. And here a larger bunker that is connected to this area, also dug out and prepared over months, now under Russian control and indeed being attacked. Also, the last thing we see is a Ukrainian shelter that has been captured by the Russians. And we're seeing it here now, the smoke. So this is in those forest areas that we've also seen repeatedly in the last days and weeks, which are simply important front positions as well, where there are no trenches, both sides attempt, and especially their drone teams, to dig in directly in these forest positions here. The Russians advance not only with foot soldiers, and we have also confirmed this today from some Ukrainian officers in the region, they advance with motorcycles and they advance with small quads and buggies. Extremely fast, no tanks or infantry fighting vehicles were involved. The soldiers confirmed that to us as well, and we also want to take a closer look at these advancements here. At this very moment, we're witnessing one of these attacks carried out by 3 Russian motorcyclists advancing across the open terrain. However, what they didn't realize here, and we're of course only focusing on the attacks in this case, that were thwarted by the Ukrainians, not attacks that were successful. That means these major attacks of the past few days, of course, have not yet been captured in the video. We now see how these 3 motorcycles are approaching a hidden tank directly, and how the tank is essentially shooting at them right away. And accordingly, we naturally have to pixelate the whole thing, leading to a big explosion where at least one of the motorcyclists dies instantly. We see additional footage from similar or comparable situations that also occurred in the same region. And now we see these Russian motorcyclists everywhere trying to charge forward during the day, during the night, again and again, using their motorcycles to exploit these gaps on one side and also to get through the gaps relatively quickly on the other side, covering several kilometers behind enemy lines. So they wouldn't come across any additional Ukrainian defensive positions further up the road ahead. Because, and that is also clear due to the personnel shortage on the Ukrainian side, we have a very thin defense. We actually don't have a second or third line, and we always just had the attempts, especially with the tank. That was more of a coincidence, but mainly with drones to chase and stop these motorcycles. If it works, then we see the footage like here. That means with some drones, probably with a few dozen drones, it works here to stop and also kill these 3-4 motorcyclists. Now we see here at the end that the motorcycles are basically destroyed after the riders were killed. However, in many other cases it's like this. They don't manage it, so the Russians just break through and accordingly are far behind the Ukrainian positions with their motorcycles, sometimes even these drone positions. The ones we're seeing here now, which are also being deployed, they're about 5 to 10 kilometers behind the front, and these positions are stormed by the motorcyclists, which makes it of course quite difficult, because we also saw in Kursk last year that these drone teams are not prepared for direct confrontation. That means they really want to fight the enemy with their drones, but when assault units with assault rifles, who were also prepared for it, the Russians directly drove there, it's a relatively uneven fight. The Russian attacks are of course backed by numerous drone operators of the Russian army, who are continuously active and working tirelessly throughout the entire time. Here again we're looking at the new footage. It's not directly from Pokrovsk, but from the vicinity of the cities Toretsk and Kostiantynivka, which means a few kilometers further east. However, we're seeing a very similar situation here. We see that the Ukrainians are attempting to strengthen their own positions, which are roughly here. We can also see the barbed wire down here. I hope that's visible. And in the background, we see the dragon's teeth, meaning all these defensive lines that have been set up on both sides. Those are Ukrainian defense lines, and now the Ukrainians are trying to reinforce their own positions here along the front. The Russians, of course, noticed it in time and are now attacking. Essentially, they targeted the vehicle with a fiber optic guided drone. Luckily for the Ukrainians, while the vehicle was completely destroyed, all of the soldiers managed to survive, and one might assume they'd flee, running back to their own defensive lines. No, they didn't do that. Instead, they went exactly where they intended to go with the vehicle, which was to this position here in the woods, the one they actually wanted to reach. We see it here and come in there. We have further Russian attacks that clearly show us that the forests and all these areas are being targeted heavily. Any ground level or horizon level objects here no longer pose a major obstacle for the Russians, because they have the ability to penetrate with these fiber optic drones, and thus also many of the hidden, even in these forests we saw, to hit the hidden Ukrainian vehicles here. It's something that naturally repeats, happening 50 to 100 times each day. Unfortunately, it's that tough in this region, and all of this leads to the Ukrainians only being able to regain the positions they lost or the ones the Russians overran with great difficulty. They can barely reoccupy the lost positions with vehicles. Supplying logistics or conducting troop rotations there is extremely challenging. This has to happen more and more often on foot. And so this tank here near Toretsk was also attacked, and then suffered the same fate as the civilian vehicles, the armored ones, perhaps even similarly armored vehicles, precisely that the Russians successfully managed to, in this case, repeatedly breaking through into infantry fighting vehicles and undermining the Ukrainian logistics that are striving to hold the front line. All these recordings we just saw have one thing in common. They involve fiber optic drones, each trailing a several kilometer long cable behind them. And we also have additional recordings from the Pokrovsk region in Ukraine available as well. And we'll take a look at that. I hope you can see it. All these lines running here, all these wires flickering in the sun. Each one of them was a fiber optic attack by the Russian army. That means we have thousands upon thousands of fiber optic attacks, which also very often run through the same areas because after all the front, at least when it's stable, is like that on both sides everyone knows where the positions are, and the whole thing was now also assessed by observers, is in that sense a catastrophe, because even if this war were to end someday, the fiber optics would break down within a year or two, seep into the ground, and leave the entire area contaminated for decades to come. And the entire soil in this area would no longer be suitable for agriculture or similar purposes because of these microfibers and microelements derived from the plastic. Just to show that all of this is, on one hand, visually striking, but on the other, it's an ecological disaster with far-reaching consequences. Not only glass fiber drones are being deployed by Russia, but also the so-called Molniya drones as well. This is a relatively new type of drone, only used for 6 months, which is extremely cheap, but also extremely powerful. We see these drones here in action, repeatedly attacked by the Ukrainian army. What these drones all have in common. These Molniya drones is that they are designed in a very simple way. That means we simply have these hop wings, we have the elevator at the back, and somewhere in this area hides a small component up to an 8-kilogram plate mine, which is carried by these drones. Often you can even see them sitting right on top. Often you see different ones. Here we see it, 2 explosive devices that are attached there, and these are always the same images, and just by the sheer quantity, the incredible amount that this unit alone took down from the Ukrainian army. You can see this video isn't released weekly or even monthly, but almost every single day, with 1 or 2 of these videos coming out showing that maybe 10, 20, 30 of the Molniyas were successfully shot down by interceptors. Intercept drones from the Ukrainian army. And that, of course, shows us, since it's not all of them, that a probably even much larger portion gets through. Here you can very clearly see the anti-tank mine that's set up in the front. Here you can see it's practically built right on top. They didn't even bother to camouflage the whole thing. So the main priority for the Russians is simply ensuring these Molniya drones carry out the mission. They could go about 50 kilometers behind the front lines and hit their targets with relative precision. That means despite the seemingly simple exterior, the technology inside is actually quite advanced, allowing the Russians to guide these devices with remarkable precision into Ukrainian targets, often relying on camera control or in some cases even GPS to ensure they hit their intended marks accurately. Next, we'll examine another Russian drone innovation, a video released by the Russian army itself yesterday showcasing a flying bazooka in action that we can clearly observe here. This is an RPG-26, which here keeps firing repeatedly at the Ukrainian positions located in this forest. What we're not seeing here, what was actually shared by the Russians on Telegram, is that after each shot, this drone returned to its base, got fully reloaded, and then fired once more at the Ukrainian position. That means what we are seeing here within 1 minute is probably actually the work of an entire day, completed by the drones. However, the entire concept is truly innovative and clever, because it's not just a disposable drone, but instead it's an FPV drone, a first-person view drone, which adds a whole new level of functionality, which can be repeatedly deployed with an RPG-26, carries out a series of consecutive attacks, and each time leads to substantial destruction and highly accurate hits on the Ukrainian position situated in this specific area. Of course, the Ukrainian army doesn't stay idle, they also try to defend themselves. And we want to take a closer look at 2 long-range attacks they carried out within Ukraine's own territory. On one hand, we see an attack on a headquarters of the Russian army, at least that's what has been claimed in the small Ukrainian town of Soledar. So now we need to get the right frame here. This is the headquarters in a formerly civilian residential house that's been occupied, a roughly 10-story high-rise building that was taken over by the Russian army forces, and where, according to Ukrainian reports, both military personnel as well as explosives and other materials are now located. The Ukrainians say we can only accept it as it is now. It was clearly an air raid that took place. We can actually see from the huge explosions coming up now that it's unlikely to be an AASM 250, for example, because we're really seeing a massive explosion that's happening here, which suggests that if a bomb was indeed used by the Ukrainians here, it most likely hit ammunition or something similar stored inside this particular house. We can also see here a large part of the building has collapsed where the Russians were located, and the Russian soldiers are arriving right now to search for any possible survivors here. We are seeing really extensive destruction though. This whole thing is atypical for a Western delivered bomb, which are usually relatively small. The ones that were delivered have a maximum total weight of 250 kilos, some only 125 kilos. And in that regard, it seems there was a major explosion here, which could suggest that the Ukrainians were right and there was indeed a Russian weapons depot located here. Let's take a look at another video from Bakhmut. Bakhmut, located very close to Soledar. And this one also shows us a massive explosion in a former residential building that was taken over by the Russians. Here's Bakhmut, once home to 75,000, now fully occupied by the Russians with 95% fled. And now we see here that supposedly a new drone of the type Privet 299 is being deployed. So Hello 299 is the name of this drone that was deployed by the Ukrainian army. And now we're seeing the replay again. The whole scene is a high-rise building. And we can clearly see from the warhead and the massive explosion that's happening here now that it's probably the so-called Ukha-Geran, or a Ukrainian modification or further development of the Russian Geran 2, is essentially a delta-wing aircraft carrying at least 50, probably closer to 90 kilos of explosives on board. Otherwise, we wouldn't see such massive explosions. In any case, it's clear the Ukrainians are trying to stay active in the occupied territories, even behind the front lines, to disrupt Russian transport and logistics routes here, even if, judging by the images from Pokrovsk, they're only partially managing to succeed right now. Not just in Ukraine, but deep in Russia, there lies. The Ukrainian army continued its operations. We have a new video that shows an attack on Nizhny Novgorod, specifically targeting the Arzamas plant for technology, which is utilized, among other things, in the production of Russian cruise missiles. This facility plays a crucial role in their military capabilities. We're trying to pause it and identify the drone. Once again, we can see it relatively well here. It is once again a Lyuty drone. You can see it relatively well by the two struts that extend back to the tail fin, and now we observe how this drone flew over passers-by, filmed the entire scene, and then also in Arzamas, which is the exact name of that specific and particular location. It crashed into the Arzamas manufacturing plant, which produces essential electronic components there in Nizhny Novgorod. The entire incident was filmed once more by passers-by, or in this case, local residents who witnessed the whole thing unfold. And we have at least 2 explosions. We can see that right away in the replay. Either the second one was a secondary explosion, or we had 2 drones that also ended up striking the exact same part right here in this area. We can clearly see it here, so there's already a fire raging down there in this area. And right now, that huge secondary explosion or second impact, not entirely clear. In any case, the Ukraine has hit something here, which is again several hundred kilometers away from their own country. We're taking a look at the whole thing. Nizhny Novgorod, yes, a relatively large city east of Moscow. And we're seeing it just as the Russian capital now appears here. It's again roughly 500 kilometers that this drone has traveled, typically launched from the regions of Sumy or Chernihiv, where they are frequently deployed and initiated, and specifically hit the Arzamas plant here in Nizhny Novgorod. This means the Ukrainians continue to try to attack at least one long-range target in Russia daily, while at the same time also in their own country. We see this in the Russian breakthrough in Pokrovsk, with the heavy fighting continuing to escalate.